It is said that there are no secrets in life, just hidden truths that lie beneath the surface. This fact has become exponentially more relevant in recent years as researchers and individuals peel back the layers of what was always thought to be the truth of who we are and where we come from. Part of this revelation or great awakening has been the eye-opening obfuscation of our collective history, the stories we have been told, the textbooks that have been written as fact, the people and experts we thought were the voices of that history, giving us the security of believing in our current worldview. But as many have been examining closer, a different view fleshes out, and upon seeing more broadly, becomes a more mind-blowing part of a possibly even greater deception upon scrutiny, one so blindingly big it encompasses what could even be thought to be a kind of galactic truth about the Earth and the illusory scaffoldings humanity has come to embrace as nothing more than fictions propped up as the invisible cage over the global population who've been kept oblivious down through the generations. In this video, I explore the local and curious history of my small city of Lynn, Massachusetts, once a colonial settlement of Greater New England and named after King's Lynn in Norfolk, England. Colonial Lynn, settled in 1629, was a center of tannery, and specifically shoemaking, which began in 1635. The boots worn by Continental Army soldiers during the Revolutionary War were made in Lynn, and the shoemaking industry drove the city's growth into the early 19th century. As the 19th century American industrial city, it ties in similarly to the many other cities that were part of the Industrial Revolution, and many of those cities still harbor the signature hallmarks of that time in the architecture and photographs that tell the tales. This video aims to show the City of Lynn's relationship to that time period during the Industrial Revolution and how it sinks into so many other cities with similar architectural remains and glimpses of what seems like corroboration of the hidden 19th century mud flood, a hypothesis that has been speculated to have occurred sometime between 1802 and 1875, but could have been even earlier. The mud flood ties into the ancient realm of Tartaria that was alleged to have been the grandest global civilization wiped from history, along with most of the peoples of the world, by a catastrophic liquefaction mudflood event, leaving only many technologically advanced global ancient buildings behind that were then used in the aftermath of the cataclysm as part of the larger reset of human repopulation around the world. Many prisons, universities, and asylums were all repurposed using pre-cataclysmic Tartarian buildings after the mudflood event to reprogram a new population that was recreated, rebirthed, and reintroduced to cities around the world, with children newly in from orphan trains in a very peculiar manner. Remnants across the globe remain, as does images of the once mighty empire's footprint shown in hidden display for all the world to see during the great world fairs of the early 19th century. Buildings, we were told, were props and wooden staging architecture, all torn down or burned in fires just after every fair's record attendance, or so we are told. London of 1851, New York of 1853, Philadelphia of 1876, the Paris exhibition of 1900, St. Louis exhibition of 1904, Chicago exhibition 1933, Brussels in 1897. World fairs used to showcase a newly created population, the old, actually inferior technology of electricity and motorization, in mocking exhibitions using the remains of the globally obliterated, much more technologically advanced Tartarian architecture that harnessed what was called ancient antiquitech, which is power source alleged to have been generated by atmospheric ether, mercury, and magnetic and electrical ionization. Once mud-flooded, cities were then devastated by purposeful fires to obliterate the remaining Tartarian building Antiquitech. The Great Conflagration of Boston, the Great Conflagration of Chicago, the Great Conflagration of Salem, the Great Conflagration of Chelsea, the Great Conflagration even in the city of Lynn, and many others around the world, with many buildings soon rebuilt in similar style, stripped of their antiquitech, almost as a twisted form of schadenfreude to the original builders. Let's look closer at my hometown of Lynn. One of the generally referenced historical books that compiles much of this history and photos from that time period, as well as many other towns, is the Images of America series of books, published by Arcadia Publishing. What is interesting about this series that produces much of the layperson's public content on local regional history in the United States is its long tradition in doing so. Arcadia Publishing was once founded by UK Tempest Publishing, which was integrated and acquired by British Historic Press, which to date owns about 70% of all local publishing of historical books in the UK. History Press goes even further back to 1897 when William Fillmore Watts Fillmore, who was a solicitor, founded this publishing company that survived as an imprint of the British History Press. He was born in 1853 and, as an aside, was also listed as having earlier been a genealogist and member of the New England Historic Genealogical Society, as well as a superintendent of Nottingham General Lunatic Asylum, which was the first asylum in the UK and built in 1810. Keep that information in mind for later, and also keep in mind that much of the historical content compiled through the years was kept and archived under numerous private publications and literary societies that acted as stewards of much of this historical information. In the Images of America book, Lynn in the Victorian Era, published in 2002, we are told that the collection of 170 plate glass negative photos shown in the book from around 1629 to 1879 miraculously turned up as a singular collection in the summer of 2000 from the descendants of a man named Ezra Fraser, who was born and raised in Prince Edward Island where the photos were found. The family thought they were photos of Prince Edward Island, and when they submitted them to be archived in Charlottetown, believing them to be from there, but later found out the photos were from Lynn, Mass. The photos were then sent to the Historical Society in Lynn. Fraser was born in 1854 and died in 1938, and allegedly had come to Lynn for 1 year, 1879 to 1880, working briefly as a, quote, photographer, unquote, around 25 years of age. After this 1 year, he allegedly lost his love for photography and became a farmer and grocer and returned to PEI. Fraser was never listed in the Boston or Lynn directory and was assumed to be part of the floating population of the time. These were transient folks who came and went and were never around long enough to be recorded. The family stated he did live on a street in Lynn, but his name was not among any of the photographers that allegedly did live in the area. Even more oddly is that most of the photos were part of an already published book from the same time called Photographic Views of Lynn, and were attributed to a man named Charles E. Cook, a photographer who was active during that time and created this book as part of the 250th anniversary of Lynn's settlement. There were no images of Cook to be found online, and it is said that Fraser's connection to Cook is unclear, and the fact that he traveled back and forth to Canada with the cumbersome negatives and retained them until his death was somehow suggestive enough to think he was involved in their creation. I'm not so sure. Why would Fraser come to Lynn for 1 year, carry negatives of photos it is unlikely he even took, but were likely shot by Charles E. Cook, and then trudged them between countries so that they could conveniently be found after his death over 100 years later? Let's look at the real person who took the photos, Charles E. Cook, and look with more scrutiny into this man. He was considered a leading photographer in Medina County, Ohio, who was schooled in the art there, although there's no record of him in the town's history. He also was alleged to have been in Lynn, Mass. To photograph the 250th anniversary settlement of the city, which was in 1879, that ended up in his book, Photographic Views of Lynn, with photos alleged to have ended up in the hands of Ezra Fraser, the supplier of all the pictures submitted to Lynn Historical Society and then published in the Images of America book. Interestingly, Cook, the real taker of the photographs, was a member not only of the Knights of Pythias, but was also a PC of the Royal Arcanum Society. The Knights of Pythias are a fraternal brotherhood of the Masonic Order. In Ohio, where he was born, as in many other locations, the Knights of Pythias orphan homes were built, quote, for the benefit of children, to provide food, clothing, and shelter to the orphan around the country from 1800 to 1830. These orphanages did not encourage placement in adoptive families because the more children they had, the more money the government would give to fund them. The Royal Arcanum Order to which Charles Cook belonged was a fraternal society that was founded in Boston in 1877 and was the first order chartered by an act of Congress. The founder of the Royal Arcanum also played a prominent role in founding the Royal Society of Good Fellows and was a prominent official Freemason and Odd Fellow. These organizations, like the Knights of Pythias and the Odd Fellows, were heavily involved in, quote, relieving the distressed, helping the sick, educating the orphan, burying the dead for those who could not afford to, and generally stepped in to assist widows and displaced children everywhere, for which there were hundreds of thousands who would come in inexplicably by distant orphan trains to fill these asylums everywhere. This all harkens back to the founder of the British press, William Fillmore Watts, who was interestingly also a superintendent of the oldest asylum in England, the Nottingham Lunatic Asylum, and even more strangely, a genealogist. What is more likely is that the cryptic organizations like the Knights of Pythias, the Royal Arcanum, Odd Fellows, and others were working in tandem with the deeper ancient secret societies to facilitate the reprogramming of newly birthed populations into the programming centers of asylum orphanages that actually were the remains of the previous built buildings of the once ancient, highly ascended Tartarian Empire, decimated by a deliberate mud flood event and an ironic mockery used again to infamously reprogram the next generation. Here is one annual report from the lunatic asylum, claiming that these buildings were important in alleviating medical and moral conditions. They were lauded as being wonderful establishments. Here is the Oddfellow Building in Lynn, constructed in 1872 and, of course, raised in 1964. Who were the Oddfellows helping? What networks were they associated with in Lynn? How many children were taken, directed, and placed by them? Lynn City Hall was built by architect Gridley J.F. Bryant, who it is said had no formal training or education in architecture, but did intern with engineers and was self-taught at construction analysis and building design, opening his own practice at 21 years old, we are told. His father, Gridley Bryant Sr., was alleged to be the first engineer who built the first commercial railroad in the United States. He also built Boston City Hall, 1860 to 1865, Broadway Savings Bank in South Boston, 1833, Bigelow Chapel in Cambridge, Mass., 123 Arlington, part of the Granite Railroad, Quincy Market, the Charles Street Jail in Boston, among many, many others, we are told. During the Great Boston Fire of 1872, 152 of his 776 buildings were destroyed, and he was, of course, commissioned to rebuild 100 of them. Bryant died in 1899 in Boston and was survived by his wife. Upon his death, his wife assembled all his books and drawings in his home and burned down his house, as it was said was stipulated in his will. It is odd that he would request this almost as if he wanted no record of his fictitious claim to having been the architect responsible for designing these extravagant buildings to which he had no formal engineering or architectural education in. It seems implausible that Bryant and his father were singularly responsible for most of the grander building designs in Boston and the commercial railroads, we are told, and it is more likely that these buildings were older, more ancient Tartarian buildings, and the Bryants were chosen through hidden fraternal order to carry their imposter cover stories. The Walnut Street pumping station in Lynn, built in 1872, demolished in 2008, was built by architect Nathaniel J. Bradley, who also designed and built, we are told, Danvers State Insane Asylum in 1866, a massive, gargantuan complex that was likely meant to house many, many people for programming, as well as involved in over 500 projects for Boston and the surrounding area. Mr. Bradley, similarly to Mr. Bryant, received no formal engineering education, and when he graduated from primary school at 17, was immediately hired as a draftsman, and after being promoted to full partner, became the lead architect at age 27 and head of the firm. He is attributed to having moved the 7-story Pelham Hotel in 1869, 14 feet to the west, which took 3 months to complete and was 10,000 tons, later destroyed in 1916. Interestingly, it says Fall of Babylon on the facade of the building. Boylston Market Building, built 1810, destroyed 1887. When we look very close in the city of Lynn at places like Market Street, Union Square, Central Square, Broad and Exchange Streets, Washington Street, Washington Square, the Common, Western Ave, North Common Street, what do we see? Even Lafayette Park. There is no people to be seen anywhere. Just long, vast, muddied roads. The First National Bank of Broad Street, destroyed entirely by the fire of 1889. Embedded in the architecture is the characteristic red and white blocked archways, not evident by color in this picture, but still present on a few rare still standing refurbished buildings as a decoration now, but was alleged to indicate the magnetic positive and negative polarity in tiquitech used by the ancient Tartarians as a kind of power harmonizer. The Lenox Building, once a manufacturing address for shoemaking, burned to the ground in the fire of 1889 as well, the red and white block clearly visible. The Washington Street Baptist Church, burned to the ground in 1902, red and white block clearly visible. Were they obliterating the Antiquitech? Goldfish Pond, 1886, and we see many children. But where are the parents or the mothers? It appears only a single adult caretaker is among them. I propose Lynn, like Chicago, St. Louis, New York, and many, if not all towns and cities, were decimated by a global mud flood event, as seen here against the backdrop of a photo taken at the Chicago Fair. This event obliterated the people of a generation, whose majestic Tartarian buildings were then later burned by fires, only to be repopulated by the secret societies with the magnitude of children and orphans that were genetically harvested or grown, even as depicted in the hundreds of postcards of the time that actually show this, and not left by unwed mothers and newly freed slaves who abandoned their children, as we were led to believe, then taken for a variety of reasons to the burgeoning number of asylums across the world. Were the people of the city of Lynn, like the people of so many other cities, forced to forget what was here before? Ask yourselves if these people were really there. Ask yourself if these drawn-in caricature people standing in front of this early 19th century architecture depicted were actually swept away by a cataclysmic mud flood event, and these people are the remnants of a once great global civilization we were told were built by people with horse and buggy? Were we lied to about our recent history as recent as 200 years ago? History wiped and memories reprogrammed with an artificial timeline, using the remnants of the global ancient Tartarian Empire as disclosed in a 1997 released classified document that references Tartar history as being rewritten, quote, erroneously by Russia to bolster and distort historical facts, or is the CIA covering up the truth by making this assertion? Was civilization reset and restarted under the robber barons through secret societies? In the Industrial Revolution timeline, jump-started to enslave a new population of reprogrammed workers? Do you believe what we've been told? Do you believe what we've always been told growing up in Lynn, Massachusetts, that there was truly a 30-foot wall molasses flood that flooded Boston in 1919? Or was there just mud? Thank you for listening. Do your research.